Hello everyone and welcome back to Sil's Cats, or welcome to Sil's Cats, and welcome to a special little project that I'm going to try and do throughout April. Will I stick to it? We're gonna find out at some point. But the idea is, because I'm taking part in the Tomes and Treasures readathon, where you create your own D&D character based on the books that you read throughout the month, I was thinking of doing a little thing where I quickly, very briefly, review the 10 books I'm going to be reading specifically for character creation, because if you've watched my TBR video, which I will be linking up above, I'm reading more than 10 books, right? Like, no one should be surprised about this if you followed me at any time. I read a lot of books, right? And I'm a big mood reading person, so I need my variety when I've told myself that I'm going to read a specific amount of books. So I'm not going to review every single one of the books that I read in April, because if I start reviewing every single book I read every single month, I would have to potentially film at least 20 videos a month. That's not happening. Super sorry about that. My brain is not big enough for this, but I can handle 10. I can handle 10 books. And so the idea is that I will be reviewing every single book that I read for my character. Her name is Ailwen, by the way, in case you haven't watched my TBR video, which you should, by the way, because it's very funny. But her name is Ailwen, and I'm going to be reviewing the 10 books that make up her character, while also telling you a little bit about her character, and specifically the thing that whatever the book that I was reading sparked, or whatever the book that I was reading created for her. And we're going to kick off the month by talking about Fathomfolk by Eliza Chan. I read this for Upbringing environment, specifically on the ocean. Now, first of all, very briefly, we have to talk about the fact that this is the Illumicrate edition, and it is stunning. I have never seen such a pretty hardcover, like naked hardcover, underneath the dust jacket. Okay. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk a bit more about this book, and specifically why I chose it for the Upbringing on the ocean. So, Fathomfolk by Eliza Chan was the March Illumicrate pick, which is why I have it in the Illumicrate edition, and it is the first book in an adult fantasy series by Eliza Chan, who is a Scottish Chinese diaspora writer. First and foremost, I don't know how long the series is gonna be. I'm not sure if there was ever like any announcement, but it's at the very least going to be at least 2 books, so keep that in mind if you want to pick up Fathomfolk. Now, I personally think that while this book is definitely adult fantasy, it's very well suited for people who are trying to age a little bit out of YA fantasy to get into adult fantasy, because most, if not almost, basically every single POV character, except for one, are what I would consider young adults, which is not necessarily what publishing means, because what publishing is talking about is older teenagers to like maybe 19-year-olds. I'm pretty sure that at least Mira is in her early 20s, roundabout, which I would consider to be a young adult, because, you know, you're an adult after 18 and or 21, depending on where you live, so, you know. But that's not necessarily what publishing means, and I do believe that Eliza Chan very much tried to give a lot more nuance to very complicated topics, such as discrimination, discriminatory systems in general, and the way that she did that, in my opinion, is very well suited for an adult fandom, for, you know, adults reading these books. So if you are someone who happened to find out that you don't really necessarily feel that comfortable with YA fantasy anymore, I would suggest giving Fathomfolk a try, because I do think that it's very nicely suited to guiding you over into the adult fantasy realm of also slightly longer books, because this wonderful thing is, I think, 420 pages, give or take. So we are embarking on a journey here. Now, we're going to talk about the things I loved first. I loved the setting of Fathomfolk. Partially why I chose it, I'm very happy that it fulfilled that, but Fathomfolk is essentially set in this city that is halfway submerged in water and halfway, you know, out of the water, and built essentially like some sort of mountain of cityscapes. And Fathomfolk itself talks about the fact that humans and so-called Fathomfolk, or just the folk as they call themselves, which are basically any kind of mer and water-based mythology creatures you could possibly think of. And this city is where the Fathomfolk live together. The city is called Tiankawi, and humans technically built it, but the folk are essentially what's powering it. And of course we have a long spread history, because of course we do. It's sadly a given. But folk are very much discriminated against in the city and have to wear so-called pankalo, which are basically kind of like bangles around their wrists that stop them from ever attacking humans. Even just thinking about trying to attack humans or using force against humans punishes them with some sort of pain that they feel through the pankalo, which... great, fantastic. Never thought about the fact that humans might attack folk, right? Because surely that's not important. The folk also, as far as I understood, that universally have the so-called water weaving ability, which, as far as I understand it, basically means they can manipulate water. Think waterbenders from Avatar. Kind of that direction, if I understood that correctly. And the folk also usually tend to have a more Fathomfolk appearance and a more human appearance, and the only thing that marks them in their human form are gills on the sides of their neck. And from what I understood, folk also tend to look the same-ish when in human form, so it's kind of hard for humans to differentiate, for example, a Rusaka from a siren, or from a dragon, because water dragons actually do exist in this universe as well. I loved the vibrancy of this tale. I loved the differentiation of the different Fathomfolk, because we have a few people from different classes, we have people from different folk background. I don't believe we have any human POV, if I remember that correctly, but we have characters in various degrees of closeness to different humans, and we also have Mira, who is a half siren, and I do believe her father was human. He's just never really talked about in the tale, because if I remember correctly, he just kind of up and left the family, which, great going, my dude. Parenting 101 and you somehow failed. Wow. Fantastic. And I loved the way that Eliza Chan wrote about these different mythology creatures and kind of like combined them into one place, and also talked about their differences a lot, and how even within the Fathomfolk there then tend to be like differences that seem almost, not almost, they are discriminatory in nature. How, for example, sirens are told to be like, you know, the manipulative ones, the ones that beguile everyone with their songs, and so naturally they're suited for prostitution work and all of that stuff. And I really enjoyed how all of these aspects work together, and I also think it was very harrowing to read, but a very good depiction of discriminatory systems based on your nature alone, and specifically also the constant, not even agony of frustration, but just being so beaten down by the consistent discrimination that you face within the system that you just don't really know what to do anymore. An almost lethargic feeling of, well, it feels like there's nothing I can do. It feels like no matter what I try, people are going to hate me because I'm Fathomfolk. People are going to hate me because I'm not human, and I don't know what to do anymore. And I personally think that Eliza Chan really nailed that incredibly uncomfortable feeling of just not knowing what to do, and thus being so incredibly close to giving up, because anything and everything you do, every kind of effort you make is going to, you know, fall back onto you, and it's not going to have been worth it in the end. We have three POV characters. 3? 4? Something along those lines. And the two main ones I would argue that we follow the most are Nami and Mira. Mira, as I said, is a half-siren, and she has been living in Tiankawi all her life. She's been growing up in the city, and she calls this city her homeland, to the point where she doesn't call herself a saltwater Fathomfolk, but a sweetwater Fathomfolk, because that is what a lot of people who've grown up in Tiankawi have started calling themselves. Meanwhile, Nami is arguably the younger one of the two. She reads like fresh out of school and now she's in a big city and she doesn't really know what to do kind of character. And Nami is a dragon. We don't meet that many dragons in the story actually. We also have Kai, who's Nami's older brother, and he is actually in a relationship with Mira, which I love these two so much. They're my children. And Nami basically gets to the city almost by accident. She's never wanted to be in Tiankawi, and she is very much the, I hate the system so I'm going to burn it down person, while Mira is the, I hate the system and I'm trying to reform it from the inside out perspective. I do think that Eliza Chan, at least to a certain extent, manages to convey that not necessarily every method of resistance is a good method, but that every method of resistance to some extent is resistance, which is the key to all of this, right? And I personally am really excited to read the second book in the series and see where Eliza Chan is going with this, because I do want to see if some of the kinks that I found in the first book are going to be corrected or at least addressed in the second book, because I do think that there's a lot more space to do things. Because if there's one thing I would have to say about this book is that it felt too short, and there was this very weird thing where sometimes it seemed to have a concise storyline that we were following, and then sometimes the chapters were just not connected at all. Like, some of these chapters legitimately felt like choppy short stories tacked onto each other that were not connected by any kind of red thread, narratively speaking. And I say this as someone who very much appreciates books that don't necessarily have a concise storyline, or that don't necessarily have a, okay, now A happened, so we're going to naturally go back to B, and B is going to lead us to C, and then the story is going to take its nice and, you know, beautiful story arc and we're going to wrap it up in the end. I don't just read stories like that, but I personally feel like Eliza Chan kind of like tiptoed between, here's a very concise story that you're going to be following, like for example Mira taking care of her older mother who has gill rot, which is an illness that a lot of people in Tiankawi contract because the waters are so polluted. And then we just randomly switch to something entirely else, and a lot of the character motivations grew very muddled in the end, and not, in my opinion, in the intentional way of, hey, obviously this character is doing weird and contradictory things because the system around them is doing weird and contradictory things, and so they don't really see any kind of solution to this except to also become weird and contradictory. But more in the sense of, why are we here? What are we doing? And I personally don't really think that that's a necessarily great thing for your book. If the characters who are carrying the story, especially in this one, because a lot of the book is about character motivations and character versus the system, and the system oppressing everyone and characters trying to deal with that daily oppression that they face. And if your character's motivation starts getting so muddled, and if your character's progression starts getting so muddled in a way that does not feel intentional, it very much does take away from the story, in my opinion. So I didn't hate it, I didn't fully love it, but it nonetheless always pulled me back. I will say that about the book. It always pulled me back, because every time I felt myself going, well, this is a little bit weird, or, oh, well, this is not my favorite thing, I don't know what the characters are doing here. There was one event, or one thing a character did, one thing a character said that made me go, huh, hold on, let them cook. I want to see where this is going. And I personally feel like, at least for a book that definitely also is going to get a sequel, because we know that it's going to get a sequel, I did like the ending, because it wraps up some of the story parts of the first book while leaving others open for a potential second or maybe third, or however many books we're going to get in that series book. And I am a big fan of endings that make you go, okay, so at least one part is squared away. Now we have a whole new mess that we're going to be able to uncover in the second book, and also some small parts of the first book were not resolved, which is totally fine by me. So overall, I think I gave Fathomfolk a 4-star because I was feeling generous, and also I loved the characters, and some parts of the ending, which I don't want to spoil, really, really hit very well. So overall I gave it 4 stars, but like the thing that really pulled me in was the setting and the way that the characters were created. And speaking of the setting, as I said, I chose Fathomfolk for the environmental upbringing that my character Aelwyn went through, or that my character Aelwyn experienced, and the upbringing environment is on the ocean. And what you were supposed to do is you were supposed to read a book that kind of like gives you on the ocean vibes. And while this book, Fathomfolk, is definitely set in a city environment, so if you want to do this for character creation, and the character creation is they grew up in a city, you can definitely, in my opinion, also read Fathomfolk. But the very important aspect of Fathomfolk is that the city life is so intensely tied to the underwater life, and I absolutely love that. So Aelwyn actually grew up on a bunch of boats or ships that moved together in a fleet. And even though she is an air genasi, which doesn't always necessarily maybe connect yourself to the water, but you know, we're just going with it. She had fun, she was vibing. The one thing she loves most in the world is to be outside in nature, and specifically, she loves being on the ocean, because whenever she is on the ocean, she feels truly free, because the only thing she can see around her is the water and feel the wind on her skin, which is something that is incredibly important to her. And so whenever she feels the need to disengage from humanity, which she does a lot, because she's not necessarily the greatest social person, to be quite honest, she will choose the ocean because it reminds her of how she was brought up, and it reminds her of the freedom that she experienced throughout the first years of her life. And so that is, in my opinion, why Fathomfolk in the end actually worked out so incredibly great for the upbringing. So if your character grows up in the ocean and you don't have a book set in there for this yet, might I suggest Fathomfolk? It works very well, in my opinion. So, yes, that was a short review of Fathomfolk, trying to connect it to the character, who, by the way, has been growing a lot more as a person, which, for anyone who creates characters for D&D, any kind of pen and paper, or just for writing or otherwise, you know that at some point they take on their own lives, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, if you haven't yet joined the readathon, do check it out. It's a lot of fun. You basically just have to read 10 books in order to create your character. Doesn't matter if they're comics, if they're books, if they're novellas, if they're short stories. We don't care. We don't judge. You can participate. I'm going to leave all the links down below as well, as I linked my TBR video where I think I explained a few things a bit more in depth. So just come join us, have fun. We're going to be reading 10 books in April, and this was my first one. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience, maybe with this readathon. Tell me how it's going in the comments down below if you're already participating, by the way. I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself. You continue having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.